This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today has been down an interesting path. One of the startup world's most in-demand executive coaches. And he's got a little secret. It starts with something he calls radical self-inquiry. And this radical self-inquiry, from his perspective, mission critical for success. My guest today is Jerry Colonna. He is an executive coach, uses all those skills that he's picked up as a venture capitalist to help entrepreneurs. He has been a partner with JPMorgan Partners, the private equity arm of JPMorgan Chase. He originally came from Flatiron Partners, launched in 1996 with his partner Fred Wilson. As those of you out there in the space might know, Flatiron had quite a bit of success and was one of the most successful early stage investment programs in the New York City area. And in my hands, I'm holding right now Jerry's book, his new book, Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. A very personal read, and I highly implore you to go grab it. Without further delay from me, let's jump right in with my guest today, Jerry Colonna. Jerry, in advance of this call, I started thinking to myself, perhaps I can get you to put your best professorial hat on to help the audience out there, because I think this is going to be a near and dear type question to you, to let people that perhaps are on either side of the fence to understand what it is about both sides of the fence that are important. And the sides of the fence that I'm talking about are essentially when you start to contrast the Western culture and the Eastern culture. I happen to be calling you from a Buddhist country today. I've happened to have spent about the last 7 years primarily in a Buddhist country. And by the process of osmosis, it's done certain things to me. What has your study of Buddhism done to you in terms of what you can teach us back?
Well,
it's a big question with lots of answers.
I actually pause and hesitate when you frame the question as you did, because I don't think of myself as, quote, studying Buddhism only because it feels like an academic approach.
You're living it.
I sort of backed into it because I was in pain. And I think most of us in the West who are socialized with a Western perspective found our way to Buddhism by way of suffering. One of the things that really moved me early on in, I guess, my study of Buddhism, in reading some of the sutras, and this is my interpretation, it's going to have a Brooklyn edge to it, so you have to put up with that. But my interpretation is something that I read the Buddha say, which was, in effect, but don't take my word for it, try it, and if it works for you, great, and if it doesn't, that's fine as well. First of all, it sort of blew my mind because it was kind of a non-dogmatic way of approaching spirituality and philosophy, antithetical to everything that I had ever been raised with. And then the relief that came from that was that, you mean I didn't have to get it right? You mean I didn't have to worry about failing? That I could just sort of move into these teachings in a particular way. Your question sort of implied a kind of distance between my lived experience and this sort of almost an intellectualized theoretical experience. And for me, kind of wakefulness that's implicit in the Buddhist teachings, a kind of an everyday experience.
If I was to probe your mind and find in you that experience, that, and perhaps there's many experiences, but that experience where it first caught your attention, the ideas, the concepts, the philosophies, the readings, What was the trigger? Where were you in your life? What was going on at that moment in time? Was it a shot of lightning almost to you? What was the feeling like when you first started to wrap your arms around these Eastern philosophies?
The moment that comes to mind, I would describe as a moment when it went from being theoretical to visceral and real. The difference was that I'd spent about a year or two reading a ton of literature, mostly the work of the American Buddhist nun Pema Chodron, but grasping intellectually and feeling my way into, okay, there's something real in this material here. And what started me on the path was reading a book called When Things Fall Apart. And then as I read that book, I had my typical response, which was highly intellectual. And what I started to do was started to read all the things that she had referenced in the book because I wanted to have an intellectualized understanding of what it was. And then about a year and a half after first reading her work, I had the great fortune of seeing her speak at just a small, intimate gathering at a friend's house in Manhattan, in New York. She began teaching on the nature of impermanence. And there was this wonderful, funny, perfect classic moment where I'm sitting there on a cushion, being a good student, saying to myself, okay, I got this. And she's going on and on about the fact that all things are falling apart all the time. I'm like, I got this. And then she says, now some of you are probably sitting there saying, I got this. I understand this. And at that point I was like, okay. And she said, but even your concept is falling apart all the time. And I blurt out, well, that's not fair. And she looks at me and she says, Catholic, right? She nailed me because what she sensed in me was the desire to get the catechism correct, the desire to get the precision of a teaching rather than a visceral lived experience. That dichotomy, that tension between intellectually grasping what are very deep concepts and an emotional lived experience of it. Well, that tension I live with every day. But it was at that moment that it kind of started to click and I actually could relax my mind and just have my being experience it.
Now, where were you in terms of age at that moment in time?
I was about 39, 40 years old, just turning 40.
You'd had some career already, though. So as we start to kind of unpack things, the question, I guess, that starts to come to my mind, what would have happened to you if you would have had those shots of awakening, the aha moment at 19 versus 39? Like, would it have affected the typical drive that us entrepreneurs have in the States to kind of sacrifice everything, get to the goal, give it all up? How would it have changed you if you would have been there in that mindset at 19 versus 39?
I don't really know. I will tell you this, had I not found it at 38, 39, I probably would have been dead. I mean, I was depressed and suicidal. The entire structure of my life, the entire house of cards of my life was falling apart. Despite the external successes that I had, things were not working. I say all that knowing that there's another old teaching, which is when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Had those teachings landed in my lap at 19, I don't know that I would have been ready. I had to go through the entire construct falling apart in order for me to take in those teachings.
You're laying out an interesting perspective and experience in your situation that things were really going south. I can't really say that things were really going south in my situation when I ended up in Southeast Asia in my early 40s. But I just knew something was wrong. It was almost like the old Matrix line or something. There's a splinter in the brain that's just prodding me and saying something's not right. This isn't meshing. So I didn't necessarily have the I'm really going downhill or anything, but there was something not right. I'm sure many people have described that feeling to you.
Oh, sure. I mean, it is both a terrifying and ultimately potentially liberating moment of realizing that it's not working. For me, it began at age 37, 38, and really culminated in my early 40s. Thank goodness I had that awful period of pain and suffering, because not some kind of bullshit masochistic, like, oh, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, but because I broke free of the structures that were stultifying and calcifying. And I suspect you went through something similar that led you to end up where you are. I am deeply happy and satisfied with the man I am today at 55. And there's no way I could be there had I not gone through all of that pain and all of that disjuncture and suffering that I went through from 38 through 42, 43 years old.
It wasn't until after that awakening that you stopped comparing yourself to other people, or were you already before this I'm just saying awakening, we could call it many things, but I'm just curious because, in the space that you're in, that some of the things that we'll talk about today, there's always a comparison. People are like, hey, what did you do? Hey, what did you do? Even if we don't want to admit we're doing it, that's happening. And clearly, I'm going to guess, I'm reading your mind, that you're not in that headspace at all today.
I will tell you, I got stuck on your use of the word awakening, because I wouldn't say that it's after the awakening, because that implies that I've woken up. Let's just say I tend to wake up and fall right back asleep very quickly. But then again, I allow myself to wake up and then I fall asleep and wake up. I would say that on the whole, for the most part, I am mostly free of that negative self-comparison. There are times when I sort of look at this person and I look at that person, or even compare myself to the person that I thought I was going to be, and I can feel badly. But I will say this, my ability to recover from the pain of that is much greater than it's ever been in my life. And someday, probably just the moment before I die, I'll be completely free of it.
Let me take you to a word that you mentioned, Catholicism. I have some understanding and experience there without going in too deep. But when you address it like that, I'm sure many people listening will smile. Some people won't smile because they will just, that's what they know. And they really don't want to know about an Eastern tradition that Jerry might be able to help them understand a different perspective. But it is quite a contrast, would be the word that I would say in my mind. As you describe Buddhism, the impermanence, it's okay to fail, and you're never going to really get it right, versus some other doctrines that people grow up with, where it's like, hey, you better follow that rule or you're off the farm, you're out. That's a really tough way to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to get your feeling for the contrast, because I think it's difficult for someone who has not been exposed to the Eastern traditions, not exposed to something like Buddhism, and perhaps is only of let's just say as an example, a Catholic mindset or an Islam mindset. Very difficult to come into, as you originally in this beginning of this conversation was describing Buddhism. It's tough. The rules, so to speak, don't really exist like they do in other doctrines.
The notion of the non-dogmatic dogma takes some getting used to, especially if, as many people are, you've been socialized to be a high achiever, which I often define as being able to step into a situation, figure out the rules quickly, figure out the best way to get an A so that you can feel safe. I want to make a distinction in your question between the religions as I were taught them versus, say, the spiritual tradition behind it. In Catholicism, as in Islam, as in Judaism, or any of the world's great traditions, wisdom traditions, there are the core teachings, and then there are the ways in which those teachings can be interpreted by frail and infallible human beings. And then those frail and infallible human beings then teach young people, and all of a sudden it gets mixed into culture. I think that one of the lessons that I felt indoctrinated in being raised a Catholic was that I was born less than good. I was born broken. The spiritual tradition's promise was that if I followed the rules and I figured things out, that I would be saved from the hellfires, that I would be worthy of God's love. The dramatic comparison that kind of blew my mind was when I began to internalize the notion of Buddhism that I was actually born whole, W-H-O-L-E, and good, and fundamentally, basically, a good human being. And the evidence of that was the mere fact that I was born human. And human beings are the only beings capable of enlightenment. And so therefore, I am good. Now, that doesn't mean I do good things every day. And it doesn't mean that I don't forget that I'm fundamentally good and lovable and worthy. But the contrast for me between what I had been socialized as, which is I am less than and I have to work extra hard to get above zero and therefore be worthy, versus a belief system that says you're fundamentally, basically good. You just forgot. And if you remember that, then you won't be suffering so much. And importantly, won't hurt other people because they're basically good. That contrast was the most liberating, relieving mindset shift I'd ever experienced in my life. The notion that I did not have to achieve being worthy versus simply be human and be myself was profoundly liberating.
I love how you phrase how you just did. And I wanted to start this conversation off going where we've gone so far, because for people that might not be familiar with you or your work, you're pretty well known as an early stage venture capitalist. And that's right there is going to be a contrast for some people that have an expectation or an idea of what they think that might be in terms of a career path versus what we've been talking about for 20 minutes. What we've been talking about for 20 minutes is I think you would argue, is the great foundation for whether it's going to be a venture capitalist, an entrepreneur, whatever, having this kind of inquiry. And I guess your phrasing would be the radical self-inquiry, which we're going to get into in a second. But that foundation is really nice for having success in the business world.
Well, I think so. I think that so much about Eastern teaching and wisdom traditions generally are applicable in all aspects of business and all aspects of an entrepreneur's life and all aspects of a leader's life. One of my favorite phrases is that better humans make better leaders. You could argue better humans make better business people. Better humans make better investors. There's a common denominator here, which is that better humans tend to live better, treat others better, are kinder and gentler, more thoughtful. And if you expand your definition of success beyond self-optimization or ego aggrandizement into this radical concept known as happiness, then all of a sudden better humans are just better. Anyway, I don't mean to be simplistic, but it's kind of fun to play like that.
I'm with you on the fun playing like that. Let me take you in a slight shift. How do you define in your own mind when you're thinking to yourself, how do you define an entrepreneur?
I think an entrepreneur is someone who builds their own organization with a particular goal in mind, with a particular pursuit of a particular set of solutions or services. For example, my grandfather, Dominic Guido, who was an iceman in Brooklyn, was an entrepreneur, right? He didn't raise any money from any venture capital, but he was just as much of an entrepreneur as anybody who goes out and raises money on Sand Hill Road. I've got friends who have launched social impact focused endeavors, and they are just the same entrepreneurs as those who have launched for-profit endeavors that are striving to be the next unicorn. I think an entrepreneur is more of a mindset than a function of the activities that folks do. And it has to do with independence, and it has to do with shouldering the responsibility of building an organization by yourself or with a small team of people.
Do you think deep down most people want to be an entrepreneur, or if they understand deep down what you just described, they want to be an entrepreneur?
I think it's the latter. I think the thing that makes entrepreneurship so compelling to people is the promise, and it's a promise of freedom, of autonomy. I think autonomy and a mastery of sense of self are really foundational components of a life well lived. Sometimes it leads people to project into that entrepreneurial lifestyle attributes that may or may not be there, but it is certainly what is appealing about being an entrepreneur, for sure.
Let me keep you with that word freedom for a moment, because you just spoke a few minutes ago at age 39, perhaps not feeling so free. And if certain things didn't happen at that point in time in your life, you quite clearly said that maybe I wouldn't be here still. So here you are at age 39. On paper, it looks like to anybody, oh my gosh, I don't know exactly what this guy's net worth is, but he must be free. He must have freedom. He's found it. He's age 39. He's hit pay dirt. Why don't we talk about freedom for a moment in people's understanding of it? Because as you mentioned also earlier, I mean, I know one particular, well, I won't say anything specific, but a particular individual, gosh, I don't know how much money he's made, maybe $1 billion. And then, you start to understand the personal lifestyle and you're just like, wow, something went completely wrong, just didn't figure out. Everyone's viewed as a dollar sign. Everyone can be purchased. And it just must be a very lonely life in many ways. I mean, look, we all want money. I want money too. But why don't we speak to this notion of freedom? Because I mean, on paper, you would have looked like a guy who had all the freedom in the world.
I introduced the concept of freedom. Let me add to it the concept of safety. And I think that we want freedom. We want the ability to choose and go in any direction that we want. But I think behind it all, what we want is safety. We want to know that we're going to be okay, regardless. The pursuit of money, if you think of modern American suburban architecture in some ways, there are all these gated communities in which we are building these McMansions, and we are trying to disconnect ourselves from the realities of impermanence, the realities of life, the realities of death, the realities of change, the realities of life as it's supposed to unfold. So we call it freedom, but what we really want is safety and security now and forever and ever. It's almost like that bittersweet wish that we have that every moment of joy be preserved in amber like a beetle from prehistoric times.
The Jurassic Park stuff.
A Jurassic Park stuff. And that the wish is that somehow we can just hold on to it forever and ever. And we mistakenly infuse the accumulation of wealth with the belief that it's going to give us that. And then there's the shock to the system that occurs when enough wealth happens that on paper you should be fine, and yet existentially you don't feel fine. What are you supposed to do with that? That's a shock to the system. And that's where I think the wisdom traditions that are outside the norm of, say, American culture start to have some insight for us.
You just mentioned the gated communities and the McMansions. And I think when anybody gets some success, I can say that I've been there, that the typical American way, at least, is that's one of the first things you reach for. I have to say right now, though, I would prefer, and I've probably not thought about this as much and as deeply as you, but I guess my hack at this is I prefer to be in a city. I prefer to be in the middle of it all. I don't want to be separated. I don't want to be put up on a hill somewhere like I'm in a zoo. I want to be able to get out and be in the middle of everyone, all different types of people on a moment's notice. And that's generally when I feel alive. When you think about the house on the hill and the gated community and yourself, how have you worked to put yourself not in that situation?
It can be argued I was in that situation, and then I realized that it didn't provide the relief that I was looking for. And in fact, it created a disassociation and a disconnection from reality and life that was not good for me. In a sense, I had to sort of step out from behind the gate and get back to living my life, even at the risk of running into impermanence, even at the risk of running into risky situations that might hurt me. In order to feel alive, I had to be willing to feel pain. If you think about that, isn't that really the second noble truth? The second noble truth being the efforts we make to push away suffering increase suffering. I had to actually stop trying to push away suffering in order to feel alive. That means you feel the whole catastrophe of everything known as life. Joy and pain, pleasure and pain, all of it. Now, when I think about the way in which I approach my life, for the most part, those ups and downs just feel totally manageable. Not in the moment, of course, but afterwards.
This question will probably have some people thinking, well, Mike, it's painfully obvious why people like Jerry as a coach. But I must ask you, because maybe I will find something in my digging, in my probing of you that is unexpected. That's generally what I try to find in these conversations. So why do people like you as a coach?
I don't know. You should do a survey.
Even right now, I'm not trying to dive too deep on everything, but people can feel there's a certain honesty, sincerity. You're being very frank. There's no BS. You're laying it out there. You're being, there's some emotion in your voice. All these things are going to factor in as to why people appreciate your coaching.
Well, thank you for saying all that, because here's a side digression. I remember one time I was giving a talk in Denver, and I was online for some iced tea. We all had name tags on and all this stuff, and I was to go on stage in a few minutes. And there was a guy in front of me, and I just thought I would play with him. And I leaned over and I said, I hear this guy, Jerry Colonna, is really boring. What do you think? And he turns around and he looks at my name tag and he starts to laugh because, of course, it says Jerry Colonna. And he looks at me and we start talking for a minute and he says, boy, you're just like the guy on that podcast. And I was like, well, that's funny because I am the guy on the podcast. The reason that comes to mind is, to answer your question, I think that when we show up for other people in the fullness of who we are, it gives them a relief so that they can show up in the fullness of who they are. And I think that if there's anything universal about why, say, someone might enjoy working with me as a coach, it's that I listen. Well, first of all, I show up in the fullness of who I am. Brokenness, happiness, joy, rawness, vulnerability, whatever word you want to apply to it. I just show up as me. And in that place, I then listen very, very carefully. The experience of being met with full presence and the experience of actually being listened to are so rare in our lives that it's like a balm for that which hurts us.
I mean, I appreciate that in this conversation, when I do a podcast, I've done 700 plus of these things, I try not to sit here with a bunch of questions written down. So sometimes, and I try to be careful about how I phrase things, but sometimes I might phrase it in a way that's not so articulate, or I don't get the exact point. And I could already see in this conversation that if we were to have a relationship or an ongoing conversation, you will challenge me to make sure that my language is precise. I can already see that as you say that you're looking for the detail and you're listening very carefully. Yes, the audience can tell that you've already got me on several questions so far. You say, well, hold on, Mike. We need to clarify the premise of where you're going before we start to go there.
Well, because I'm interested in the engagement. I'm more interested, for example, in your definition of awakening than in my response to your question. I'm more interested in why that matters to you than in hearing myself talk. Because, I listen to my brain all the time. Right? I know what I'm going to say to something. Whereas I have an opportunity in this moment to hear your story. I have to quash my impulse, which is to dive in and ask you questions.
You're more than welcome to. You're more than welcome to. My story is quite simple. I got hired by a Hong Kong bank to do a speaking tour in 2013. I was in 25 Asian cities, like 10 countries. I did like 50 presentations. It was spread out over 4 months. When it was over, I said, I cannot go back to America. But the why, there was so much curiosity in that 4 months. So, you can spend so much time in America where people don't pay attention. Or they're not, I'm not saying I need anybody to stroke me or anything, but, people just are doing their own thing. But then, you go to Asia and you're in all these different countries and people are curious, whether it's the high-end folks at the funds that you're talking to that want to talk content or just the man on the street. And I found that curiosity from everyday people insatiable. And I was like, well, this is just fantastic. Everybody just wants to talk. Everyone wants to communicate. Maybe some people are going to be friends, maybe not, but everyone seems to be overall pleasant across from Tokyo to Beijing to Shanghai to Guangzhou to Shenzhen to Hong Kong to Singapore to KL to Ho Chi Minh City, you name it, to Bangkok. That was really interesting. I'd been to Asia before, but not in that being able to be in so many countries in a small period of time. Anyways, long story short, when it was over, I said, where did I have the most fun? And I guess the fun would have to be defined as where people were the most curious, and that was Saigon.
How old were you?
Maybe 42, 43.
And what did you leave behind in San Diego?
Oh, I was single. I could be footloose and fancy free.
Yeah, but what did you leave behind?
I left housing there and family and everything, and primary residence was in Virginia at the time. So I could leave San Diego, but I didn't plan it really. I went not with the idea that I would stay. It was a 4-month tour. I just figured I'd come back. But then in the middle of it, it was like, oh, wow, I can't go back. No way.
Why?
The feedback from people, the curiosity, the ease at which conversation could happen. And, sometimes you can spend a lot of time in America where people they've got the wall up and they're closed off. Look, here's a great concrete example of something that I think I've witnessed for many years now. If I go back to the States and I get in a car, I can invariably find myself where somebody wants to get road rage. It could be a teenage girl or whoever, an older guy, whatever. And then you come to a place like Saigon and there's so many millions of motorbikes and people are almost in this kind of Zen mindset where I've never seen road rage. I'm sure it exists in some way, but overall there's a cooperation. There's this hive mind that's operating. There's this respect. And then you add in the curiosity factor for me as an outsider. And of course, I think also a place like Vietnam, let's face it, as an American, you generally would not expect that kind of love to come from a place that Americans have made a big mess. You take all that together, there you go.
What I'm hearing is, I could be projecting into this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing in your experience was there was a kind of radical acceptance of you, which, I have a theory, which is that I think we're all organized for the pursuits of love, safety, and belonging. What it feels to me is that you found belonging. You found people who would just pause and listen to you and be with you and accept you in somewhat surprising ways, places like Vietnam. By finding that, you were able to sort of settle into who you really were meant to be. What a beautiful journey. I don't know if that has any resonance.
There's a lot of fairness in that assessment. You've been down this path. You've spoken to a lot of people. You're a perceptive guy. You can see how things unfold. But I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. I think just the unexpectedness of it. And look, that's not to discount anything to friends and family in the States and whatnot. I've been telling people forever in the States that if you took 25 college-age friends, and I often say just guys or whatever, you took 25 college-age guy friends and said, okay, you're going to Saigon for a year, your expenses are paid or whatever. I used to say that maybe 75% would not go back after 1 year. I've generally started saying that 100% would not go back after a year, just because it's such a radical shift than what we've currently got going on in the States. And again, I'm not trying to put down things, but it's just when you reach that point, like you're beginning of this conversation, when you're describing what happened to you and you're opening up to a new doctrine like Buddhism, that can shift and hit everybody if they get the opportunity.
I think that that's right. I think the experience that you're talking about is really quite deep and profound. So to put it back into the question that you asked me, what do people sort of like about me as a coach? I think it touches, I think the experience, I hope that the experience that they're having is similar to the experience that you surprised yourself with, were delighted by landing in these other places, which became a sense of home, a sense of belonging. Instead of encountering road rage, I can encounter a completely different experience that allows you to be more you in a particular way. I think that that's liberating.
It's funny, you just used the word home. Friends and family or people on the podcast or whatever, people always ask about home, and they're talking about the home of where I grew up. And I always pause in my mind because I'm thinking, well, I don't necessarily think of home maybe in the exact terms that I did when I was 13, or 25 or whatever. Home changes. Home becomes a concept or the best place that you are for your life at that moment in time.
So it's like perhaps you're home wherever your heart is.
Yeah. I mean, all this great technology that you've been involved in your career has really afforded something that I think the average person has not yet experienced. Oh, great, we've got our cell phones and stuff. But when you can use that tech to separate you and I by 8,000 miles right now, and then you can use that tech to immerse yourself in another culture, you can still have that sense of connection to home. You can still reach out and talk to mom and dad and all that kind of stuff. That's quite amazingly fun.
And yet there's something about home that's a really powerful word for you, isn't there?
I don't know, but it depends on what home becomes or what home means at that moment in time. It's tricky because I definitely don't think of it as home in the sense that I would go back to a particular place in Northern Virginia outside DC, even though that's where a lot of family is. I don't think of it like that. I think home is just trying to find a place where, oh, I'm comfortable. Oh, I'm peaceful. I can do my work. I can concentrate. My mind is clear. There's nothing, heavy stuff will appear here and there, whatever, but then it passes and you move on, right?
Yeah, I would define that as belonging. Home is the place of love, safety, and belonging. Home is the place in which I can be me. I can just drop all the persona, drop all the anxiety, drop all the self-consciousness. I can just laugh. I can cry. I can experience the full catastrophe known as life. That's home.
Now, as I listen to you, though, I must think as a coach, your effect on people, I haven't seen a in-person large presentation that you've given, but I imagine the effect, because you're being very personal with me, you're pulling things out of me. So your effect as a coach, when it can be one-on-one, it's just got to be dramatic. It's very different. And I'm sure for the person that you're speaking to, the person you're coaching, and for you.
So that's an observation?
You're already figuring out my interview style, right?
Look, I do these multi-day leadership retreats we call boot camps. And on the first night, one of the things that I say, and at this point, people know what to expect because my reputation is out there. Wired did this article on me called, the title of which was, "This Man Makes Founders Cry." On the first night of the boot camp, I'll often make this one observation, this one point, which is that the bullshit stops here. The spinning stops here. that this is a place where people can just stop trying to outperform one another. Just try to stop one-upping one another, or to run away from the demons that have been chasing them all of their life, and to just acknowledge that nobody's crushing it. Nobody's winning all the time. That life is filled with ups and downs, and that is the normal. Or as I said many times, just because you feel like shit doesn't mean you are shit. It's just a place. I suppose at this point, it's such a foundational part of who I am. I got relief by allowing myself to be this way with myself, that I think others come in, and I'm surprised when they find that this is somehow different, that this experience is somehow different, because this is just who I am. It's like the guy I talked to online for iced tea. It's like, yeah, I'm just me. And I'm just curious, is it deep? Is it probing? I suppose. But it just feels very human. I find human beings incredibly fascinating.
As you just mentioned spinning, I was thinking to myself, as you were asking me questions and probing me, I had no desire to spin in my answers. Now, I am curious. I want you to elaborate on this in a second, if people do end up in your universe and do attempt to spin initially. But I had no desire to spin. But the tricky thing is, you were asking me these questions, I realized, I was like, oh man, you've got to get refined fast, because you're now on a podcast. And Jerry's now flip the script. You've now got to answer these things tightly in the sense, well, partly for performance, for people to at least understand, because in terms of limited time, that was probably driving me too, but also just to be precise to your question, because they were good questions. And, I want to answer them honestly and directly. Even though I've only spoken to you for 15 minutes, I don't want to bullshit you. I don't want to spin on you. I have no desire to do that, so I want to give you what you're asking for.
Behind the why that I was asking, which can sometimes be a little aggressive, I understand that, but behind the why is really a genuine expression of empathy, which is, and it's okay. It's okay if your responses aren't precise. It's okay if you're kind of a mess in a particular moment. I mean, to me, if we can all just give each other a little bit of space to just kind of be real and just hang out, and the result is that it feels like you're talking to somebody you've known for 20 years, well, wouldn't that be fun? What if our businesses were run like that? What if our societies were run like that? What if, to go back to one of the questions I asked you before, there was a kind of, I used the phrase, acceptance that you experience when you did this tour of these Asian countries and decided that you enjoyed being there. What if that was just the norm? What if we just showed up and we didn't have to perform and didn't have to get an A? What if we just organized our businesses around the intellectual pursuit because it was fun and not because we were trying to prove something? It just seems less exhausting to me, and it seems a lot more fun.
I concur. Now, I hope you will not kill me too much for not going the line item path down your book that is now hitting the stores. But I thought, given that you've had a chance to speak to a lot of people, I just wanted to take you down a journey that I didn't necessarily know where it was going to go. And I think we did a good job of going in unexpected places, hopefully.
I have no preconceived notions. I just enjoy every single conversation I have. and that's all that I'm interested in, is to wake up and just have, oh, look at this human being that I encountered today. This is fun.
I agree. The book, Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. People will have to go in. Very personal accounts. People are going to find out a lot more than they have found out on this conversation. They will have to go in and dive in and dig deep. Is there a best place that if somebody wants to find out more about you, Jerry? Of course, everyone knows how to use Google, but is there a particular website that you would like to direct people to, or a Twitter handle, or somewhere you would like to send people?
Sure. They can go to rebootbyjerry.com, which is the book site, but they could also go to reboot.io, which is the company's site. In there, there's a ton of resources. I have my own podcast. We do a lot of free courses and that sort of stuff just to help folks. But any one of those doorways, the Buddha once said there are 84,000 doorways to the Dharma. Pick one. So there's plenty of doorways into all of this experience. It's perfectly fine in whichever way they want to.
Where am I reaching you today? You in New York today?
I am. We have the book launch party tonight, and then tomorrow is a bunch of publicity tours. I'll be in New York until Wednesday. I've been traveling on the road since last Sunday. I was in Phoenix early part last week, and then I go home to Boulder on Wednesday night. And then I'll be home for 2 weeks and then on the road again for 10 days and back and forth. So it's that kind of a busy period, but I'm enjoying it.
I give you props, though, because for that kind of a schedule, to be this relaxed and chill on a conversation and engage, I mean, I don't know how you do it. I think my nerves might be a little frayed.
Well, it's important to get rest. It's important to not drink too much coffee. It's important to meditate. So those things all help.
Hey, Jerry, listen, I appreciate you taking the time today. Good chat, very interesting. I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, my friend. You be well and enjoy your time there. Now, which country are you actually in?
I'm calling you from Saigon, Vietnam today.
Oh, my youngest son, Michael, is on his first trip to Vietnam right now. He's 22.
He'll love it.
Yeah, he is loving it. He's sending me photos every day.
Great stuff.
All right. Be well, sir.
Take care, Jerry.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.